Cada día, mientras parpadeas, nacen 1000 estrellas. Cada día, nuestro cuerpo transforma alimentos en energía. Cada día, nuestro cerebro transforma información para una solución. Cada día, al abrir los ojos, inicia un viaje de aprendizaje. El camino de la educación es el camino de la evolución constante. Y la única constante es el cambio. Evolution transforma la manera de enseñar.
¿Qué tal, profesores y profesoras? Mi nombre es Carla Peregrina y estoy al frente de Relaciones Institucionales en Evolution. El día de hoy tengo el gusto de presentar el webinar TIC y Pensamiento crítico, una combinación poderosa para el aprendizaje. Nos acompaña para ello el doctor Stéphan Vincent-Lancrin, quien es analista senior del Centro de la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económicos de la OCDE, para la Educación, Investigación e Innovación, CERI. Él es responsable del proyecto sobre el futuro de la educación superior University Futures, cuyo objetivo es informar y facilitar la toma de decisiones estratégicas por parte del gobierno y otros actores clave en educación. También es co-líder del grupo de trabajo sobre capital humano de la Estrategia de Innovación de la OCDE. Welcome, Dr. Vincent-Lancrin. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. It is really my pleasure to be invited and be able to talk about this very important topic.
Thank you so much again. Les recuerdo, por favor, que si tienen alguna pregunta o comentario, los pueden dejar en la caja de chat de cualquiera de las redes sociales donde nos estén siguiendo para que el doctor al final pueda responderlos. Please, doctor, we ask you to be so kind as to start this very interesting talk that you bring us today about information and communication technologies and its relationship with critical thinking. Please.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to actually present you why creativity and critical thinking is so important, and then why it is important in the digital world, and then show you how you can integrate digital tools as part of the teaching and learning of creativity and critical thinking. So I'm going to present a project that the CERI has had ongoing for a few years on how to develop creativity and critical thinking. And as we know, the OECD is an economic organization, and one of the reasons why we started this project is really because we wanted to see how to develop the skills for innovation and the skills that are very important in the digital age. So one of the things that we did initially was to analyze the skill that people in employment declared was the most important in their job. And for that, we could actually compare people in employment who were having innovative jobs compared to those who don't have an innovative job. So having an innovative job was defined as working in an organization that is at the forefront of innovation on the one hand, and on the second hand, to be involved oneself as part of the innovation process. And you can see here that we didn't ask people, what do you think are the skills for innovation? But in fact, what they say that the most important skills they had to use in their job was creativity, coming with new ideas and solutions, or the willingness to question ideas, critical thinking. And you can see here the numbers, which mean that you're 3.9 times as likely to say that this is a very important part of your job if you have a highly innovative job than if you don't. An interesting point is that you can see that on all of the different skills which were tested, this is actually more, you use them all more intensively than people who don't have this kind of innovative jobs. That is based on work that was carried out in 19 countries, European countries, Japan, and a few South American countries. It is something which is very much in line with what employers in big companies say as well, so that's really why it is so important to develop these skills. Creativity actually is one of the new skills that has come up, but innovation is one of the very important ones, complex solving, critical thinking, and that has been consistently the case over the past few years. It will be interesting to see what happens with now the rise of generative AI, and I'm going to talk a bit about that toward the end, but, there is, even so, generative AI is actually showing that it can be creative to some extent. Probably that will be one thing to boost creativity rather than something that will substitute for people's creativity. So why is it so important? So, it's also beyond economic reasons. It's also because creativity is really one of the things that we do enjoy as human beings, and because critical thinking is so important for democratic societies and in this digital world where, misinformation, fake news, etc., have become so part of our new landscape, and unusual authorities are not as strong as they used to be. So what does it mean? So that's really part of a big trend that we have in almost OECD countries to go towards more competency-based curricula. So one way to think about it, at the OECD we have the learning compass. Another way to think about it is, to look at the different types of skills, the technical skills, the knowledge, the know-how, and the know-what, the know-how that we have in all the different domains, social and emotional skills, but also these higher order skills, which are, creativity and critical thinking. And the big question is how we do integrate that as part of people's actual learning. It's important to know that, of course, all these different skills overlap. You need to have knowledge if you want to have critical thinking, or if you want to have creativity. You need to have social and emotional skills like persistence if you want to learn something. But what's important is that they tend to be domain-specific, meaning that they take a different domain, different form in different domains, different disciplines. Not the same in mathematics, in cooking, in music, etc. And also that if you repeat the acquisition, then they become domain generic or transversal, because then you acquire this habit of mind that makes you actually more creative in all the different types of domain that you have. So big question is, what does it mean in practice? There is not much opposition to that agenda in OECD countries. As I said, most countries do have that as part of their curriculum. But the big question for teachers is, how do I implement that in practice? What does it mean to be creative in mathematics when I'm in school, or in music, or in whatever other subjects that I have to teach and students have to learn? And so we've done that project where we try to articulate a language about that, what that means in education, and how we can actually make it tangible and visible to teachers. We try to develop examples of resources for teachers, to develop professional development plans. So what are the things that teachers need to be able to do that? And also to measure the effects of what we are doing. At the OECD, usually speaking, we always tell people that they should be evaluating and monitoring whatever they do. And so we've tried to actually do the same in that particular case and develop instruments for that. So we've been working in 11 countries for 2 school years to try to co-develop with teachers what it means, to develop creativity and critical thinking as part of primary and secondary education. And we are currently doing the same in higher education, working with 26 higher education institutions in different countries. And what we try to do is to develop tools that can exemplify what we are talking about. So have a kind of a professional representation of what this means for teachers to develop these types of skills. So first, very important point is actually to define what you're talking about. So what is creativity? And it's pretty common, among psychologists. They tend to agree, that the main people who have been working on that, and basically it's the ability to produce work that is both novel and appropriate. Novel meaning that, it has to be new to you, at least, to someone, but also it's not just any new thing that is creative. It has to be answering a problem or be part of a system, because it's very easy to do things which are new. In fact, we can always do that. So it's really about two different things. In terms of processes, there are two ways of thinking about it. It's about ideation and exploration, or divergent thinking or exploratory thinking. And it's also actually to making new combinations of things, which is usually called convergent or integrative thinking. It's also an attitude. It's about getting at ease with things, daring, have new ideas. And what's very important in education is that it doesn't have to be new to the world, so you don't expect your primary school students to actually develop something that is new to the world, but that is new to them. So it's a bit more than the usual learning. It has to stretch them a little bit further than what, they would usually do. Critical thinking is different. It has some commonalities with creative thinking, but it's really the ability to evaluate judgment, statements, ideas, and to actually see in relation to alternative explanations. So it's basically about two things. One, it's good thinking rationally about things in a slow way, taking time to see whether things are right or not, well argued, factually right. But it's also about understanding the limits of theories and actually understanding what are the other ways of thinking about it. So it's about challenging assumptions, considering other perspectives on different theories, and possibly actually take a different one. So what we've tried to do to illustrate that was to develop a bank of pedagogical resources for teachers to make it visible to them what it is that we're talking about. And I'm going to go through different types of elements we have developed: rubrics, examples of lesson plans, assessments, and student works. I'm going just to go into the two first one. And so we have actually developed rubrics, which is one of the things that is pretty common in English-speaking countries, but not so much in many other OECD countries. And to develop pedagogical activities, to redesign or improve pedagogical activities, to assess student work, but also just as a way to talk with students about what it is that we're talking about. So that's one of the rubrics. We have a general rubric, and you can see that we have descriptors for creativity and critical thinking, which you can read, and that what we've tried to do is to have a simple language, inquiring, imagining, doing, reflecting, that actually summarizes what it is that we have in mind, and that we hope will become kind of a habit or routine of thinking for teachers when they think of the lesson plans or the pedagogical activities that they are providing to their students. So for example, it's making connections with other concepts, generating and playing with new ideas, producing something that is personally novel, and reflecting on that. We have one which is more comprehensive, that some people among the teachers network preferred. And we have developed also a bank of domain-specific rubrics for music, science, mathematics, language art, etc. As some of the teachers we worked with felt that it was more appropriate to them. We also have a series of rubrics which is for assessing students on creativity and on critical thinking. So here you have the one on creativity, which actually shows the different levels of students and how they can actually progress through that. And it distinguishes between the final product, when that's the only thing that you can observe, as well as the pedagogical process, if you can actually see how students have been learning about things. And so, sometimes you may make a wrong turn at the end when you do your product, but you have nonetheless learned a lot of things, even if you have failed, because part of, creativity and also critical thinking is also is something that you learn sometimes by not succeeding and by failing a little bit. We have the Spanish versions on our website so that, you can actually find them there and use them if you want. Rubrics are meant not to just assess creativity or critical thinking, but it's also actually something that you want to combine with the other domains that you have been teaching, that is the content knowledge, the procedural knowledge in the field that in your learning outcomes, and possibly other dimensions. Here we've put communication as an example of the other thing that you could possibly do. So now let me give you two examples of how you can develop these through examples of lesson plans or activities, and how you can actually use ICT and digital tools to achieve this goal. So first is actually how you can use digital for both in presence or for remote learning. In terms of, let me start with one example of science lesson plan, which is called Why Controls My Health, which was developed by colleagues at Michigan State University, and which is a long project-based learning activity of 20 lesson periods, and with a lot of action research after that, and which was really designed to learn about a lot of different things. So let me show you what is the big structure of this lesson plan. So it's something that was developed in Atlanta. Let me think. Yes, no, I'm not sure. But anyway, so but you know, in where you have a lot of Afro-American people, and one of the common diseases that they have is have much more diabetes than most other people, which is, you know, very important because we want to start by teaching something that matters to the people who learn about it. And so here, that's a decomposition of all the project plan, you know, and so in big lessons, you know, the first two lessons are about why does, you know, a student, Monique, have diabetes, and then students are taught about type 1 and type 2 diabetes, then actually how they can describe this in terms of organically, and so they look at the effects on the heart, they do glucose tolerance tests and to understand about that, and so they can also experiment a little bit and do some scientific experimentation. You know, then they learn about genetics and how does Monique's family affect her diabetes, you know, so what is genetic about it and what is all these genetics. Then they look at the environment. So can the environment where Monique lives actually makes a difference to her diabetes or not? And for that, they use plant growth and see how the environment affects the environment to see to what extent this actually works. And then it continues about the relationship between the environment and the genetics, you know, so different things that they have been doing before, and then what they can do in terms of nutrition, for example, and to actually make this environment healthier. And they finish with a project, which is a community action project, where they try to work in groups to actually work on how to improve the situation and make the environment healthier for people who suffer from diabetes. Because it is a project-based learning lesson, they actually always have to draw hypotheses, and they have a drawing lesson board where that's gradually evolve, because they have to actually make assumptions about why this is happening, and then the teachers direct them in that, you know, to explain to them. But they have to come up with new assumptions as new knowledge is presented to them, and they can explain some of this new knowledge. So that's really the way it is meant, you know, in big terms for the traditional in-presence learning. So one of the things we ask people to do is to, here you don't see it, unfortunately, but is to map some of these different steps to the rubrics, you know, I've shown you before, you know, and so that you can see that, let's say, during my step 5 or 6, then people have a chance to develop their creativity, you know, or inquiring, or then in lesson 7, they do a little bit of critical thinking and etc. So that's really one way for teachers to step back and to see actually to what extent they are giving their students opportunities to develop their creativity and their critical thinking. So how can they use these digital tools? You know, for in-presence learning, for example, in that, well, in the first lesson, you know, one of the things they can do is to use you know, something very simple, a video, you know, and what it means to have type 1 and type 2 diabetes. When they go to do some the tolerance test, you know, and the effect on glucose on the heart, etc., they can use for that, you know, virtual labs, and there are very interesting experimental settings. One of the things that is interesting in the virtual labs is that you can actually experiment several times because, you know, it's virtual, it's easy. And one of the things that you can learn from example from it is that when you take different measures, you get different results. and so that, there is this probabilistic element to truth. For the genetics aspect, a lot of genetic simulator, and actually where you can learn also by doing, making hypotheses, trying, and see what happens, and depending on the different types of assumption that you are making as a student. And so, there are a lot of tools that allow you to learn these concepts that are digital and where you don't necessarily have to, go through anything that is physical. The other thing we did, we've developed, we have over 100 examples of lesson plans and pedagogical activities for primary and secondary. And during COVID, what we did was an adaptation of many of them for remote learning. And so in that particular case, for example, one important thing when you do remote learning and when you want to use these tools is to have good rules, about these online discussions. But now, we're using a lot of different tools. We know that you can have a mix of plenary and breakout discussions. That's very important to have rules for that because, the teacher then, when they leave their students alone, they have to behave, and the teachers have to rotate, to go from one place to the other. You can have, for the driving question board, which is essential when you do project-based learning. You can have collaborative whiteboards which are digital, like, tools like Mejora or Padlet, for example. Then use dynamic documents for individual students, like Google Drive, etc., so that you can actually add about your assumptions, what you've been doing as when you go, which is important because then the teachers can actually check on what each of the students have done individually, and they can check as things go, even so they are not in presence. Very importantly, of course, they have to visit the breakout groups, and that has to actually drive what they're going to do in plenary online sessions, as they would if they were in presence with, the entire plan. And actually, the communication action project could be people going where they are, so in different places, talking to their communities, and actually then do something digital, a collaborative movie, PPT, perhaps a podcast, an audio thing that actually would encapsulate what are the kind of things that they could do to improve the situation in their community. Now, the big new thing obviously has been ChatGPT and, the awareness that generative AI is with us. And that has been, I would say, a big challenge to creativity and critical thinking. I've written twice creativity, I see on that slide. Because especially for creativity, we could see that, this generative AI is generating things, and so in many ways has some level of creativity. So what can we do with that? One of the lesson plan that we have which is in an interdisciplinary lesson plan, is basically a study which is called My Region What If. So it's about imaginary world or counterfactuals, where students are asked to focus on a particular historical event about in their region, the historical period of their region, which has led to changes in the arts or on technology, or it could be anything else, in fact. And then they have to imagine alternative histories for their region based on what would have been the region look like if it didn't have happened, if this, and so what would have been these alternative courses of history. And then, they're asked to have project in the future, imagine these counter factuals, and propose some ideas and solutions to then desire to change things. So that's one interesting and open, and you can see the details, on our website again, that develops both creativity and critical thinking, because both of them are very much about perspective taking and thinking about alternative to a particular situation. How can you use generative AI? So, to support creativity for that, for example, you could imagine that, students could ask GPT to draft a story about what a specific group of the population would have become if, this given event, historical event, had not happened. Then try to be more specific, adapt the story, and possibly with the help of GPT, so that it becomes more related to their own context and the group's interest. And then, it could also help them to write a short play, for example, that showcase different characters, different groups, in the different society that, that they imagine could have been, and then just enact it, so direct it, rehearse, perform it. And also that's a way for them to discuss the strengths and the weaknesses of, what generative AI has produced in terms of their own creativity and the final product that they've had. We could imagine more or less the same for critical thinking. We could provide students, and that could be adapted, but provide them with a prompt, with a theme. So here that could be this historical event, and ask them to. So what's important here is not to define too much what it is, but and let them actually play with ChatGPT or any other generative AI to illustrate one of the aspects. Ask the different students to do it. Ask them to verify the information, to correct whatever is wrong, and understand, who else have said the kind of thing that GPT said. Share this text with others and have a discussion about that, about the assumption that the different solutions have, whether they are actually convergent or divergent. And that could actually help to have a deeper discussion about the significance of the historical event that they have been discussing, as well as a nice way to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of generative AI and the use that they have had for it. So that's typically an example of how it can be also used for critical thinking. So let me conclude by highlighting a few lessons that we have learned as part of this project. First, we've realized that the rubrics that we have are not enough, in terms, if you want teachers to develop, they need more. And so we've actually developed this design criteria for good lessons for creativity and critical thinking, which basically highlights some of the challenges of it. The first one is actually to give something that really creates the students' need or interest to learn. So something that is challenging enough for them. So that's number two, don't give something which is too easy, but something that actually relates to their interests, with their community, and that will actually make them, in some cases, and especially in primary education, one of the things, for example, is to give philosophical questions. It's something that many teachers don't feel comfortable about because we don't have the answer to them. But in fact, at that age, it's something that is very much of interest to them to think about these very big ideas. So as I've mentioned, be challenging. It's not just a tick box exercise. It has to stretch you. Otherwise, it's not interesting and it's not going to produce the types of results that we want. And in fact, generative AI and all these new tools can actually make it more challenging and more interesting in many ways. What we've seen is that people have to be clear about the technical knowledge in the domain that they're teaching. So if you're doing something, let's say in visual arts, students have to learn something in visual arts. It cannot just be about critical thinking or creativity. Perhaps you want to do something on critical thinking in visual arts, but perhaps then it's no longer a visual art lesson, it's a one on philosophy, and aesthetic philosophy, and which is a good one, but you have to be clear about what you're trying to teach. And the creativity and the critical thinking must be embedded in the learning of that particular knowledge, because you need to learn about, the different disciplines. Something that we found that was more challenging than we expected was to actually develop a product. In many cases, our education has been too much towards taking an exam, passing a test, a quiz, and moving on to something different. No, education has to actually be about doing something meaningful, authentic for the students themselves. And that's really sometimes one of the real challenges that educators do have. And perhaps, also because they have the incentives to do that. So here, the second set of design criteria are more the big challenges for the teachers themselves, And so one of it is to let students co-design part of the product and the solution, or part of the problem. Because if you specify too much what it is that you want, then there is not much room for the students to exercise their creativity or their critical thinking, because then if you make it yes, no answer or just right, wrong, then it doesn't work very well. So it's very important to deal with problems that can be looked at from different perspectives, and where different perspectives can be approached, and there is some interest in doing that. So For example, in science, socio-technical problems are very interesting for that. Things like climate change, which is not just a problem of science, but also a problem of sociology, of technology, etc., of history, politics, and so that makes them much more rich. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't do problems with right, wrong answers, but there has to be a balance, and that means that teachers have to leave room for the unexpected, because when you do that, it is possible that the students will take you to places that you don't know very well, and where you're not the master that you wish to be for that. And so that's one of the things that need to be understood. And one sometimes of the answers is that you don't know what the answer is, and that's fine, because it happens a lot in the real world. That even researchers, most of the time, they cannot really conclude firmly about one thing or the other. Sometimes they can, that is great, but it's not the most often. And finally, you have to do something that none of us have really time to do. It's includes space and time for reflection. So what have I learned? What do I know about creativity, about critical thinking, and to give feedback and constructive feedback, and to learn to give and receive constructive feedback about the things that have been actually done. So I'm going to finish and just say that the development of creativity and critical thinking can be done with or without digital tools. Digital tools can make it easier in some cases, but what is the most important is really the pedagogy, which can be powered and enriched by ICT. But to be honest, ICT is usually not essential for it. What you need is to think of interesting learning scenarios that can have pedagogical tools or none, but that actually are going to challenge students and that are intentional. Probably the most important aspect is that intentionality. You're not going to develop the creativity or the critical thinking of your students if you don't try to do it intentionally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It has been a very interesting talk. For now, if it is okay with you, we will give rise to questions from the public that follows us on social media. The first one says, educational systems traditionally focus on the subjects that can be assessed very precisely, like math or language. How can educational systems start assessing creativity and critical thinking?
Well, actually, some systems do. As you know, the next PISA 2022, so that will come out next year, is about creative thinking. So that, there was some standardized assessment that was developed, and that has been taken by, many different countries around the world. And there are a few countries like Australia or France that have developed standardized assessments of creativity and of critical thinking to evaluate where their students stand in these different areas, because that's part of their curriculum. And so they're trying to go beyond the traditional subjects in these different areas. Now, you are right that, many of the assessment, they try to do things that have been done for a long time. We have to keep in mind that it seems very natural to us that, let's say, mathematics or science or subject knowledge is easy to assess. But the main reason is because that's where we have put all our effort in the past decades and centuries, and so we are it's a new field, in the case of creativity and critical thinking. Critical thinking is already partly assessed, to be honest. Creativity, that's something new because people have the idea that it's really for the gifted people, in many cases. But it can be done, and some countries are already showing us the way.
Thank you. So much to learn. Much is said regarding the workplace that many of today's roles will disappear to make way for new ones. What will be the role of creativity in the new professions?
Well, let me first say that old jobs have always disappeared to give way to new jobs, so there is nothing very new in that has been, the fate of mankind. So probably things have accelerated a bit, but that has always been the case, and it will continue. And we will need actually creativity and to adapt to the new world, to solve all the problems that we have, from the environmental problems, how to deal with the digital transformation and all the new challenges that it has, to face new issues like pandemics. It has shown that we needed to be very creative. We had a lot of critical thinking because we had to make quick decisions of a scientific nature, and this will continue. And the good news, in fact, if we think of how ICT will play a role in that, and especially, this new AI, that the new thing that is coming up, is that perhaps we will get some help, but we'll have to be very vigilant as well. Perhaps this will not be as helpful as we want. And so we will have to continue to be human beings with our own creativity and our own critical thinking. And that will be very important in the next few jobs, given, even if we have the help of all this technology.
Thank you so much. Well, now, if you have some final statement or a comment that you want to share with our public.
Yes, so I think that what I would like to say is that, teaching and paying attention to creativity and critical thinking is very important, not just for the sake of creativity and critical thinking. Of course, those are very important skills, and I've mentioned it, which are important for to participate in the labor market, to participate in democracy, and also to have a good life, that we enjoy, and we human beings have always thought in that way. But I believe what is very important, especially when you are a teacher or an educator, is that it matters a lot for learning in general. So that's something that allows students to learn much more deeply what they're learning, have a stronger and better understanding of what it is that they're learning, and that also makes the learning much more enjoyable. So that's really why this is so important, because that makes learning playful, enjoyable, and much deeper beyond developing the skill that the economy and people actually want to have. And so that is really one of the things that I want people to keep in mind. And perhaps if I have a second one, I would say the second one would be that something I've already said, but which is really essential, that you cannot expect that this will happen if you do nothing about it. It's not because you're good in science, in Spanish, in history, that you're a strong critical thinker or that you're very creative. And so that's why that has to be learned. Like for knowledge, discipline, some people will always be stronger than others and they will go a further way, but this can be developed for everyone. And that's really what we're trying to do when we do education. And so that's part of the new philosophy that education should have in the future.
Wow, amazing. Well, thank you, Dr. Stéphan Vincent-Lancrin. It has been a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you very much again for accepting this invitation. Y para nuestro público, les quiero recordar que tenemos redes sociales, que por favor nos sigan, que si les gustó esta emisión la compartan por todos lados, que nos etiqueten, que nos arroben. Y pues esto ha sido todo por hoy. Doctor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Cada día, mientras parpadeas, nacen 1000 estrellas. Cada día, nuestro cuerpo transforma alimentos en energía. Cada día, nuestro cerebro transforma información para una solución. Cada día, al abrir los ojos, inicia un viaje de aprendizaje. El camino de la educación es el camino de la evolución constante. Y la única constante es el cambio. Evolution transforma la manera de enseñar.